The more witches he found, the more he was paid to find them. In a cold room, a woman is held still while a stranger works a long pin into her bare skin, the arm, the shoulder, the back, hunting for the one spot that will not bleed and will not hurt. When he finds it, he stops. That spot is the proof. The devil, they believe, marks his own with a place that feels nothing, and the man bent over her has just found it. She will hang. He is not a mob, and he is not mad. He is a professional, hired for the work and paid by the result. In England, they called him the witch finder. In Scotland, the pricker. For a few decades in the middle of the 17th century, this was a trade a town could send for. Magistrates and church elders called him in, and he arrived with his tools, worked through the accused, took his fee, and moved on. This is the story of where that trade came from, how it worked, and how it died, brought down, in the end, not by the law, but by a single doubt about the one thing it claimed to find. The whole trade rested on a single belief. When a man or woman sealed a pact with the devil, it was held, he set a mark on the flesh to seal it, a patch of skin gone dead to all feeling, a place that felt nothing at all. It might be a mole, a scar, a birthmark, a fold of skin no one would look at twice. But it was there, waiting to be found. And that belief did something exact. It turned an invisible crime into a physical thing. Witchcraft itself could not be seen, but the mark could. And a crime you can search a body for is a crime someone can be paid to find. What made the finding worth paying for was the law. In Scotland, the Witchcraft Act of 1563 made witchcraft a capital crime, and made even the act of consulting a witch punishable by death. In England, a statute of the same year was rewritten in 1604 under James VI and I to reach anyone who fed, kept, or dealt with an evil spirit. Under laws like these, the mark was no longer a village suspicion. It was evidence, the kind a court would send a person to the gallows on. The law had built a demand for proof of witchcraft. It had not built anyone to supply it. For most of a century, that gap stayed quiet. In England, witchcraft cases were tried by the travelling judges of the assizes, and under their hand the numbers sent to death stayed low. Then the machinery broke. The Civil War from 1642 cut the assize circuits and left cases with local justices of the peace, without the senior judges who had held the line, and the caution went with them. The demand for proof was still there. The check on it was gone. That was the opening. The doctrine had decided what to look for, a mark that felt nothing. The law had decided what it was worth, a life. All that was missing was someone who would sell that skill, walk into a town, lay hands on the accused, and find, for a fee, the mark the law was waiting for. The mark had to be found on the body, and the way it was found was the needle. The accused was stripped and searched inch by inch, and then the skin was pricked with a pin or a long bodkin, again and again across the body, until the point struck a spot that did not bleed. That was the proof. The test looked like a search for something real, and that was its power. It turned a matter of rumour into a matter of the body, examined and recorded by a man who called himself an expert. In Scotland, this pricking or brodding was the whole method. In England, it was joined by others. The accused kept awake for days until exhaustion loosened a confession, and, for a time, the swimming test, in which a bound suspect was thrown into water on the belief that the water would refuse a witch and hold her up. That last was challenged early as unlawful, and in England it was largely dropped by the end of 1645. The needle outlasted it everywhere. The work was paid for by result. A witch-finder charged a fee to come to a town, and stood to earn more for each witch he found there. His costs, the keep of his horses and his assistants, all of it met by the people who called him in. That was the shape of the trade. and its logic ran only one way. A man who found nothing was a man who had cost a town money for nothing. A man who found witches had earned his fee and proved his worth in the same stroke. Nothing in the arrangement rewarded him for clearing the innocent, and there were always customers. The demand came from below, from towns, parish magistrates, and in Scotland, the kirk sessions of the local church, each wanting the suspected among them named and dealt with. Once a community had decided it harboured witches, the witch-finder was the man who could turn that fear into a conviction a court would accept. The people he was set to find were, overwhelmingly, the same kind everywhere: poor, old, isolated, and female. Of the roughly 4,000 tried as witches in Scotland across the whole era, some 5 in 6 were women. So the trade sat on a foundation that could not fail to feed it. A frightened town supplied the suspicion, the law supplied the death, and the witch-finder supplied the proof in between, for a fee that came only when the proof was found. The first man to make the trade famous held no office to practice it. In March 1644, in the Essex town of Manningtree, Matthew Hopkins, the son of a Puritan minister, claimed to have overheard local women speaking of the devil. The accusations were begun by an older man, John Sterne, with Hopkins as his assistant, but it was Hopkins who named himself Witchfinder General and let it be understood that Parliament had commissioned him. It had not. The title was his own, and it worked. That first hunt ended in a mass trial in 1645, at which 19 people were hanged and 4 more died in prison. Hopkins and Sterne then went on the road across East Anglia with female assistants who did the pricking. Hopkins claimed he took only 20 shillings a town. The records show Stowmarket paid him £23 plus travel, and in 1645 Ipswich levied a special tax simply to cover his cost. At Bury St Edmunds that year, 18 people were hanged in a single day. In 14 months, Hopkins and Sterne are thought to have sent between 200 and 300 people to their deaths, more than the whole of English witch-hunting in the century before them. It did not last. By 1646, a clergyman named John Gall was preaching against him, and magistrates had begun to ask by whose authority he worked. Hopkins retired, wrote a short book defending his methods, and died on August 12, 1647, most likely of tuberculosis, in his own bed at Manningtree. He was buried the same day. A story later grew that he had been accused as a witch, put to his own swimming test, and hanged. But the parish register records an ordinary burial after illness. The trade outlived him, and its deepest ground was not England but Scotland. Scotland executed witches at roughly 5 times the European rate, and there the pricker was a recognised occupation, perhaps 10 men working across the century. The most notorious was John Kincaid of Tranent, active from around 1649 to 1662, and known as the Common Pricker. His fees survive. 6 Scots pounds for brodding a woman named Margaret Dunholm, with £4 more for wine and food. And 6 Scots pounds was worth only about 10 shillings in English money. By 1661, he had the freedom of the burgh of Forfar and a large house in Edinburgh. When he was later arrested and released, his bail was 1,000 Scots pounds. The trade paid well enough that some forced their way in. One was a woman. Christian Cadell, from Newburgh in Fife, watched a pricker work and, the trade being closed to women, cut her hair, dressed as a man, took the name John Dixon, and went north to sell the same service, working through Elgin, Forres, Inverness and Tain, paid by the head like any man. The craft that hanged women for the marks on their skin had, in her, a woman living off it. She was not alone at its edges. George Cathy worked Lanarkshire, John Dick elsewhere, some 10 men in all, and for a time nothing checked them. But even in the record of Kincaid's own cases, a dangerous thing had begun to surface. People who had been prodded and convicted, protesting that the pricker's mark was the only evidence against them, that without his needle there was nothing. The doubt that surfaced in those appeals did not stay at the edges. It went to the heart of the method. Prick a frightened, exhausted person over the whole body, hundreds of times, and a spot that fails to bleed or feel is not a discovery, but a near certainty. And some prickers made sure of it. Investigations found needles built to deceive, blunted or made to retract into the handle, so the skin was never truly pierced and no blood could come. The mark that had sent hundreds to the gallows could be produced on almost anyone by design. Once that was seen, the Trades Authority began to fail. Judges grew sceptical of the needle as evidence, and the accused kept appealing on the grounds that it was the only thing against them. In 1662, the Scottish Privy Council moved against pricking done without warrant, and Kincaid, the common pricker himself, was arrested, held in Edinburgh's Tolbooth, and released only after admitting he had used deception. Another pricker, John Dick, was imprisoned in the same period. Historians treat the fall of these two as the moment the practice broke. The men who had made a living finding the devil's mark were now the ones under suspicion. The hunts wound down with it. Prosecutions fell sharply after the 1660s, and the last executions recorded in the central courts came in 1706. The final case was a woman remembered as Janet Horn, old and senile, tried at Dornoch in 1727, accused by her neighbours of turning her daughter into a pony to ride to the devil, and burned. The name is probably not even hers. The earliest accounts do not record it. Her trial was of questionable legality, and it was the last. 9 years later, the law itself changed. The Witchcraft Act of 1735, in force from 1736, repealed the old statutes of 1563 and 1604 and abolished witchcraft as a crime altogether, replacing it with the lesser offence of pretending to practice witchcraft. The state now held, in law, that there were no witches to find. A trade that had lived entirely on finding them had nothing left to sell. There is the first turn of this story. The witch-finder was not brought down by mercy for the people he condemned, or by any reckoning for what he had done. He was brought down when the one thing his trade rested on, that guilt could be read on the skin, and found with a needle, stopped being believed. At the start of this story, a stranger searched a woman's skin for a spot that would not bleed. There was always such a spot on a body pricked 100 times, or pricked with a needle made to lie. There had to be. It proved nothing, and it never had. The mark the whole trade existed to find was never there to find. The witch-finder was not a hunter of hidden evil. He was a man paid to say he had found one. The legend gives him a fitting end, seized, put to his own swimming test, and hanged as a witch himself. It never happened. Hopkins died in his bed, of illness, unpunished, like almost every man of the trade. And the truth is colder than the legend. He was exposed not as a monster, but as a fraud. And the trade died the day the world stopped believing there was anything on the skin to find.